My dear brothers and sisters and dear friends, this, as has been mentioned by our presider there, is on the theme of Nebuchadnezzar's image, and today the first presentation of that is the dream and the image. And just to give a breakup of what we're actually covering and just a few other aspects of that, this prophecy, which involves Daniel the prophet, that was given to King Nebuchadnezzar, of fulfilled past, present events and exciting future events for the world and you and I, is something that's just amazing. And for all Bible students and people hearing it for the first time, it's something we can really get into and understand and relate to. So the very first one, and I want to just add there that the presentation I'm doing today was prepared by Peter, and Peter and I presented last year on these subjects. So I'm reading and presenting Peter's matter today, and then you'll see there that on the 19th, next Sunday, I carry on the theme of the timeline and the stone. So we're looking first of all at the background of Nebuchadnezzar, of Babylon and Daniel in today's talk. The conquest of most of the Western world in the 4th century BC by Alexander the Great allowed the Greek tourists of the area access to the civilizations of the Babylonians, the Persians and the Egyptians. These ancient tourists brought back home with them amazing stories about the wonderful and huge man-made sites, and so began the 7 wonders of the world. Whereas we might travel today to see perhaps the Sydney Opera House or the Eiffel Tower, or pass through the gates of Buckingham Palace, or visit the Himalayas, these 7 wonders of the ancient world became the must-see list for those ancient travellers. There was the Great Pyramid of Giza, the only one of the 7 wonders left still today. There was the Colossus of Rhodes, a massive statue of the sun god Helios. The lighthouse of Alexandria, standing 100 metres tall. For many centuries, it was the tallest man-made structure. It used a mirror to reflect the sun by day and had a fire lighted at night. There was the mausoleum at Halicarnassus, the temple of Artemis, the statue of Zeus at Olympia, and last of all, there was the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. It is this last one, Babylon, together with its hanging gardens, that is of most interest to us today. The tourists of the time brought back home amazing stories of this huge city that King Nebuchadnezzar had built. It sat on the banks of the just under 3,000 kilometres of the long Euphrates River. It had 90 kilometres long walls surrounding the city, and it was said that it was wide enough that 2 racing chariots coming from opposite directions could pass each other at speed without any problem. Euphrates rivers flowed through it, and steel bars descended from the bridges going over the river down into the water to stop the enemies gaining entry. King Nebuchadnezzar was very proud of his city and felt extremely secure. Probably the most interesting of the stories were of the beauty of the hanging gardens and the large quantities of gold used. Stories came in of the king's wise men and engineers having some form of slave-operated pumping equipment that enabled water to be raised to the highest level of the city, flowing down waterfalls and terraces, through garden beds and huge trees planted in deep soil beds for the enjoyment of the citizens. It had vines and creepers and all sorts of flowering plants, certainly making very beautiful gardens, and hence one of the wonders of the ancient world. The surrounding countryside, on contrast, was reported as being quite arid. So to see this huge, beautiful city pop up, standing tall and proud with its high and wide walls, beautiful coloured bricks, paved roads, golden idols, huge archways, it would have left a huge impression on the traveller's mind. The story of the time was that King Nebuchadnezzar put extra work into these gardens, not just for his own pleasure or pride, but mostly to appease his queen, who missed the rolling green hills and valleys and natural beauty of the country she came from. What's interesting is there have been a few commentators who have said that Babylon never existed, because these days archaeologists can find virtually no trace. But this is exactly as it should be. For God said through the prophet Isaiah chapter 13 and verses 17 to 20 that it would be completely destroyed. The prophet also stated that even the shepherds wouldn't want to pitch their tents there. But in its day, wow, what a place. Josephus, the ancient historian, has quoted in his writing about the beauty of the city and its hanging gardens from records he had read as written and passed down by one of the Babylonian priests. And the travelling public in Alexander the Great's time brought back great stories of those wonderful sights as already mentioned. The king was actually very, very rich. He had plundered all the countries he had overrun. So Babylon was also known as the city of gold as well as for its beautiful gardens. Here's an interesting quotation from Scripture about that. God's prophet Isaiah in chapter 14 verse 4, at the end of the verse records, and was forecasting its demise, said, "How hath the oppressor ceased? The golden city ceased." King Nebuchadnezzar made a statue of himself. It was huge, made out of pure gold, as recorded in the book of Daniel chapter 3. 60 cubits high and 6 cubits wide. If we take the generally accepted cubit as 18 inches, that is approximately 27.5 metres high and 2 3/4 metres wide. That's roughly just under 4,000 tonnes of gold. There were golden flowers set into the bricks and on the sides of the walls in Babylon. There were 300 altars to other gods, 600 altars to heavenly deities, a golden image of the god Bel, and a golden table in the temple are believed to have weighed over 2 tons by the description brought back by visitors. There were golden lions and a human statue in the temple made of gold about 6 metres tall. There were golden goblets, plates, and so on. Truly, it was a city of gold, very rich. King Nebuchadnezzar was a very powerful king, an autocrat, and anybody who disobeyed him or couldn't or wouldn't do as directed did it at the peril of losing their life, as we shall shortly see. He had inherited the Babylonian kingdom from his father Nebuchadnezzar and became known as the greatest king of that empire. He had become famous for his military prowess under his father. He was a warrior king for his military. He was a warrior king and used to very strict discipline. He fought for his father on the battlefields, leading armies in the conquest of other nations. And that's just one example. It was his brilliant military strategies that led to the defeat of Pharaoh Necho XI at the Battle of Carchemish in 605 BC. It was shortly after this that his father died, and Nebuchadnezzar ascended to the throne and quickly consolidated the kingdom under his rule. We mention all this to help set the scene. The beautiful rich city, lush gardens, well fortified and secured, built on the banks of a mighty river, the pride of the king and nation, and the character of the king who was an absolute ruler. And according to travellers, things built of gold absolutely everywhere. It's very important to note that in the background there were other men. They were from the royal household in Jerusalem, the capital city of the kingdom of Judah. who had been taken captive by the king Nebuchadnezzar's army. The Babylonians had overrun Judah as they had done to almost all other kingdoms of the day. But interestingly, even though an autocrat, Nebuchadnezzar knew better than to kill or enslave all his captives. He understood the value of having in his administration intelligent and capable men. As recorded in the book of Daniel in chapter 1 and verses 3 to 4, he had given orders to Ashpenaz, the master of the eunuchs, and quote, "And the king spake unto Ashpenaz, the master of his eunuchs, that he should bring certain of the children of Israel and of the king's seed and of the princes, children in whom was no blemish, but well favoured, and skilful in all wisdom, and cunning in knowledge, and understanding in science, and such as had ability in them to stand in the king's palace, and whom they might teach the learning and tongue of the Chaldeans." We won't read all the verses in this chapter, but here is recorded that the king Nebuchadnezzar wanted to use these captives from Jerusalem to his advantage. He ordered Ashpenaz to feed them special food and wine, actually a provision of the king's meat and wine, so that at the end of 3 years they might stand before the king, well-fed, healthy, and speaking the king's language. There were 4 notable men recorded of this group, and their names were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. These 4 made a request that they would prefer not to eat the king's food. We suspect this food had been given for the multitude of the idols and gods in Babylon, and it may also have included unclean pig's meat, both of which were against their Hebrew beliefs. They instead asked to be tested on a diet of vegetables and water. At the end of 10 days, their request had gone in their favour as they looked in much better health than the others in this group. This is all recorded in the first chapter of Daniel. The closing verse show that when they were brought before the king at the end of 3 years, verse 29 says, "And in all matters of wisdom and understanding that the king required of them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and astrologers that were in all his realm." Hopefully now we have finished setting the scene. We have a very rich, powerful and autocratic king who wanted all his needs met instantly. We have a renowned city of gold, famous lush hanging gardens, well fortified and feeling impregnable. And we have the Jewish prisoners, very intelligent, hand-picked to assist in the affairs of Babylon, but working invisibly almost in the background, the chief of them being Daniel, who we know as Daniel the prophet. Everything was going along as normal when something happened that really rattled the king. In the 2nd year of his reign, round about 600 BC, the king had a dream. Not any ordinary dream, but he thought a very significant dream, one that required a response. And the only problem was his mind had gone blank, completely blank. He just could not remember the dream. This is all recorded in Daniel chapter 2 that our chairman read to us as an introduction. So he called his wise men, the astrologers, the sorcerers, the soothsayers, to show him the dream and give its explanation. He obviously sensed it was very important, and he would have been also very super curious about it. Of course, we know that these wise men had no special powers, and they could not tell the king his dream, let alone think of a possible explanation. But his servants pushed the point. Tell us the dream. No king should ask his magicians and sorcerers to know the dream and then the interpretation. Oops, not a good answer to an autocratic king who insisted on absolute obedience. What's interesting is when you then read verse 9 of chapter 2, where King Nebuchadnezzar states, the king becoming very frustrated with them, But if ye will not make known unto me the dream, there is but one decree for you. Ye have prepared lying and corrupt words to speak before me, till the time be changed. Therefore tell me the dream, and I shall know that ye can show me the interpretation thereof. His servants responded, though, again, not very wisely, with phrases like, "It's a rare thing the king requireth. No king or ruler or lord has asked such things. There is not a man upon earth that can show it. Only the gods can, whose dwelling is not with flesh." All very inflammatory words to an angry, impatient, all-powerful king. And as verse 12 says, he ordered the execution of all the wise men of Babylon. And this is where Daniel and his 3 friends enter the picture, because that death penalty was also inclusive of them. Verse 14 says that Daniel responded with counsel and wisdom to Arioch, the king's guard, whose job it was to also collect Daniel and his 3 friends for execution. Verse 15. Why is the decree so hasty? This chapter shows that Daniel went into the king and requested that he be given a little time to show the king the dream and the interpretation. We can only presume when we read through this record that God made the king remember Daniel and his 3 friends, Hananiah, Michael, and Azariah, that they were 10 times smarter than the rest of the king's so-called wise men, because the king allowed it. Daniel made it known to his 3 friends, who together prayed to God for help, who in a night vision was revealed the dream and its interpretation. And Daniel responded in verse 23, "I thank thee and praise thee, O thou God of my fathers, who hast given me wisdom and might, who hast made known unto me now what we desired of thee. For thou hast made known unto me the king's matter." Daniel was brought in before the king. Daniel does not take any praise for himself or his friends, and he reminds the king why he had this dream. The king had been thinking about the future, what was going to happen in the future to his mighty capital and to his beautiful gardens, etc. And he says with all confidence before the king, as in verse 38, "There is a God in heaven that revealeth secrets and maketh known to King Nebuchadnezzar what shall be in the latter days. The dream and the vision of thy head upon thy bed are these." And then Daniel further says in verse 31, "Thou sawest, and behold, a great image. This great image, whose brightness was excellent, stood before thee, and the form thereof was terrible." Daniel then goes into the description and explanation of the king's dream. Now we have got to say at this point, my dear friends, that in the 2nd chapter of Daniel, we have what is probably the simplest and most compact prophecy from God concerning the destiny of the nations. And we use the word destiny here as we will show just how much God's hand is involved in our world's destiny even through to today. The dream of a great image is a prophecy that covers the whole period from about the year 600 BC, when the prophecy was delivered, down to our own days and beyond into the future. God gave the king a dream in which the destinies of the kingdoms of man were represented by a mighty image. And the image was unlike anything he had dreamt before. And strangely, this image was made up of different metals. And it's interesting that they were declining in value from the top to the bottom, but gaining in strength and power. The head was of gold, the breast and arms of silver, the belly and thighs of brass, the legs of iron, and the feet part of iron and part of clay. As the king watched the image in his dream, he saw a stone cut out without hands fall on the feet that were part iron and clay, breaking them to pieces. And as the image fell to the ground, it was crushed and ground to powder by the stone which the wind then blew away. And then this stone grew into a great mountain and filled the whole earth. This prophecy is very, very important to all Bible students. It is what we call the history of the world in a nutshell. And let's see why. From the interpretation that the prophet Daniel gave to the king, Nebuchadnezzar, we learn the divisions of the image predicted accurately the 4 world empires which successfully exercised dominion over the earth from that time onwards. Many of us probably either studied this or even touched on this in our ancient history lessons at school. And I have to say here, I never had any history lessons at school. But Peter says here in verse 32, the image's head was of fine gold, the breast and his arms of silver, his belly and thighs of brass. And as in verse 33, his legs of iron, his feet part of iron and part of clay. In verse 34, thou sawest until a stone was cut out without hands, which smote the image upon his feet, that were of iron and clay, and brake them in pieces. And then verse 35, then was the iron, the clay, the brass, the silver, the gold, broken in pieces together, and became the chaff of the summer threshing floor, and the wind carried them away, that no place was found for them. And the stone that smote the image became a great mountain and filled the whole earth. Just think, my dear friends, of the atmosphere. This autocratic king, entirely entranced as this man of the one true God, unravels the king's dream. The king, listening with great interest, would have had a slow and then speeding up recollection of exactly what Daniel was saying as far as his dream went. And he would have known that that is exactly what he had dreamed. But what did it all mean? It would seem from the chapter that Daniel was not interrupted. Such was the king's fascination with Daniel's divinely revealed revelation of the dream and then of its interpretation. Daniel continued with a very interesting and intriguing interpretation. Even although Daniel did not name the nations represented by the metals, apart from him saying to the king, thou art this head of gold, we know from looking back over history who they were. And when we look at the image that we have on the screen before you, we knew then that gold represented the king of Babylon, as Daniel had told King Nebuchadnezzar. And it was only a process then of going through history to work out what the other parts of the image represented. So we see the image symbolised Babylonian, the Medo-Persian, the Greek and Roman empires. And what is really important in world history and in this prophecy, they were followed by no other worldwide powers. And the depiction of the feet of iron and clay very cleverly shows the nations today, some strong, some weak, never agreeing, never cohesive. The interpretation of this dream demonstrates to us all just how strong God's hand is in the history of the world. For here, during the reign of King Nebuchadnezzar, he clearly outlines the overall history of the world over the next few thousand years. How well is the Babylonian kingdom described by gold? It was so rich, it had raided gold from all countries it had conquered. And as Daniel rightly said, thou, O king, art this head of gold. And Peter makes the comment in his presentation here. I remember my history teacher at school telling us about the Hanging Gardens of Babylon and just how huge and splendid they were and how rich in gold the city was. I remember having it explained how the Medo-Persian army diverted the river around Babylon so that they could send in the cavalry and infantry into the so-called impenetrable fortress. The Babylonians thought no army could get in, but the smart Medo-Persians sent in firstly their cavalry under the iron bars that used to block shipping on the river. Now with the river diverted, the horses and the riders could easily go up the bed of the now empty river, the horses' hooves and legs taking most of the river mud with them. By the time the soldiers went in, They were marching on virtually dry ground, and so that great city fell, and the next stage on that image took power. And I remember my history teacher told us how the Persians were known for their silver coins, so aptly describing by the chest and arms of silver on the image of the king's dream. And how well this image of his dream showed the two arms being the Medo and Persian alliance. And then with great interest we listened as it was described to us how Alexander the Great trained his army, how he was a brilliant general and strategist, and how he loved the story of his soldiers polishing their brass shields like mirrors, reflecting the sun into the opposition's eyes, temporarily blinding them in battle. Such a great reflection of the belly and thighs of brass in the image. And then the Roman army, truly a hard and extremely disciplined force, so well depicted by the legs of iron. We learned of their use of iron in the armour, the shields, the spears and swords, and the steel battering rams in their slave oarsmen-driven boats. And we were told of the Western and Eastern empires of the Romans, so aptly portrayed by the two legs in the king's dream. And how we were all told of the iron rule of the Romans, a very tough and disciplined force. And then we were told, no more world powers. The Roman power steadily declined. Invasion from the barbarian nations, the Visigoths, the Vandals, the Huns, all these broke down her iron rule. The feet part of iron and part of clay started. The image prophecy is now, right now, today, fulfilling this prediction about these nations. Some strong, some weak, not cleaving one to another, just as iron and clay can't be mixed. And we have to note that many have tried to make another world dominion, but all have failed. Think of Charlemagne and the Holy Roman Empire attempt, Napoleon, the Kaiser, Hitler. Not even the League of Nations got anywhere, and the United Nations too is ineffective. But remember the prophecy. The stone that was cut out of the mountains without hands, the stone that destroyed that image, this depicts divine intervention. And this, my dear friends, today is where this part of the presentation, this two-part presentation, stops. And next week I will continue with a more detailed explanation of the timeline and explain and expand upon that stone. What does it mean that a stone was cut out without hands and become a great mountain and then fills the whole earth? We look with interest then to a continuing of this theme and study next Sunday. Thank you very much.